Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So our reading this morning is an excerpt from a 1972 sermon delivered by the Reverend David Eaton. The sermon was called "The Road to Reconciliation." The most persistent problem in American life has been the gap between the values espoused and the values observed. The reality of American life, once one moves away from the orator's platform, has been deeply embedded in disvalues, discrimination and inequity, selective and self-serving freedom, moralism without morality. Candidates for elective office talk about bringing us all together. Over and over, we hear the word reconciliation. The usual road to reconciliation begins with such lofty expressions as "we are all brothers and sisters and must learn to live together, young and old, black and white, rich and poor." The road usually ends with "we will all live together in harmony as one people and one nation." This road is built on pontifical fantasy. It is an illusion. The road runs from the rainbow to soft, puffy clouds. And as we travel this road, we feel good. We feel secure. In fact, we owe a lot to the pontificating orator. For a short while, our longing needs are met. Whether we be young or old, black, brown, red, or white, rich or poor, we can fantasize at stretching out our arms across the aisles and holding hands. For in each of us is the longing for harmony, not disharmony, the longing for personhood, not depersonalization, the longing for life, not death. I wish this road were real and not an illusion. I wish the wind would not blow the soft, puffy clouds away. I wish the rainbow would not fade with the lowering of the sun behind the hills of reality. But the illusion has within itself its own awakening. How long could the oppressed have walked in brotherhood and sisterhood with the oppressor? How long could the poor have walked willingly and joyfully hand in hand with the rich? The real road to reconciliation will not be like that at all. The real road to reconciliation will be a bumpy road, one that speaks to the issue of survival with the same degree of concern that it speaks to the issue of security. It will deal with the dream deferred with the same determination that it presently deals with being number one. It will run through the pain and depression of our lives, as well as to their lofty peaks of hope and aspiration. Some years ago, when I was being interviewed by the search committee of this church, we got into a discussion of the Black Power movement. And I was asked, "Reverend Eaton, how do you see your ministry?" And I said, "I am first a black man, and second an individual." Very alertly, the search committee asked, "Well, then how can you call yourself a humanist and say you can minister to all people?" And I looked at the committee and said, "I believe with every sinew of my being that the first society that builds its priorities on the disinherited will be the first universal society. When our agenda is tailor-made for the poor and the disinherited of our land, then we'll understand that the last can be first. Then we'll understand that when we do it for the least of our brothers and sisters, we do it for ourselves." I wish I could be more comforting. I wish in every sermon I preach I could heal the sores, could help you slip through life as smoothly as possible. I certainly would be more popular. I would run less risk of being misunderstood. But if I understand the traditions of the prophets, if I'm to use my insight, if I'm to struggle with you so we can develop our insight together and come to a new perception, it will be a bumpy road for us. And it will start with our fears and our depression. It will start with the oppressed among us and in us. And it will go a bump at a time towards a new heaven and a new earth. It's a bumpy road, but it's the only one I see that will get us there. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. So I didn't know when I signed up to preach this morning that I would be talking to you all after another newsworthy week. The last time I was here, it was the Sunday following the announcement of the Defense of Marriage Act decision. And the news of the verdict in the George Zimmerman trial technically came out 2 Saturdays ago. I know that it's been on my mind all this past week. It's a tiring thing to think about. It's a disheartening thing. But as I looked through the reading that I'd chosen for this morning, I couldn't help but notice that David Eaton is encouraging us to start exactly there with our exhaustion and our disappointments. Start with the oppressed, he says, among us and in us. Start with our fears and our depression. So I'll start today by telling you a little bit about the disappointment that was at the root of my interest in this topic, actually. The life and ministry of the late Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend David Hilliard Eaton. I became a UU in Washington, D.C. in my early 20s at one of our largest, most thriving and vibrant congregations, All Souls Church. A few years back, I began telling people in that congregation that I was planning to become a minister. And people, within and outside of that congregation actually, began saying something to me over and over again. I kept hearing almost the exact same sentence repeated from all different people. They said, "Be careful, not every place is like All Souls." Not every place is like All Souls. Okay, what does that mean? Of course, churches are different, especially in our movement. And naturally, I know that not every church is as big as All Souls. It has about 1,200 members. It's one of the largest churches in our denomination. But not everyone even likes big churches anyway. What else could be so different about All Souls from all the other UU congregations out there in the world? Well, I started to see some of the things that were different as I visited all kinds of churches in Boston, where I went to school, and all over the country. There were a lot of things that I took for granted at my home church that I didn't realize were the product of effort, of a real countercultural sense of purpose. And one of the clearest ways that I realized All Souls was different was that there was a lot of difference present at All Souls. Cultural difference, racial and ethnic difference, class difference to some extent, language differences, differences in national origin. My home congregation is not only big, it's also one of the most multicultural congregations in our UU movement. And it's been that way for more than 40 years. The data I found from last February, from February 2012, showed that 23% of adults and 43% of children at All Souls self-identify as people of color. 23% of adults, 43% of children. And as I began to ask around, asking people why this church has such a strong and somewhat unique multicultural identity, I started to hear the familiar name of David Eaton. Now, I had heard David Eaton's name many times since I first became a UU almost 10 years ago. But I'm curious, how many of you had ever heard of David Eaton before reading the blurb about my sermon this morning? Raise your hand. Anyone? Okay, one. That's very common. Most people, it turns out, when I left DC to go to seminary in Boston, I discovered that almost no one had heard of David Eaton. None of my classmates, only about a handful of other UU ministers really had heard his name. At All Souls in DC, we talked about Reverend Eaton all the time. David Eaton was called to serve as All Souls senior minister in the summer of 1969, making him the first Black senior pastor ever called to serve an established, predominantly white UU congregation. He served as All Souls senior minister until his death in 1992, a 24-year ministry, a very long time. And during that time, Reverend Eaton transformed All Souls Church from a nearly all-white congregation, only a handful, about a dozen of people of color in the congregation, into a church which was, by all accounts, balanced equally throughout the 1970s and 80s between Black and white members, about half and half. At times, the congregation was actually majority African American. I told my friends and colleagues this story at seminary, and they were shocked. By and large, no one knew who Eaton was or his significance for our movement. No one knew that there had ever been a majority Black UU church, apart from a few churches that were founded specifically as Black UU churches in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unfortunately, most of those were founded without any denominational support. The idea that a church could undergo such a dramatic demographic transformation was unheard of for most people. But some people did know David Eaton's name. They were the people who were answering my questions about how All Souls got to be the way it is today. Their explanation for All Souls' multicultural character, however, seemed overly simplistic. They didn't actually seem to think it had anything to do with David Eaton, the man, the individual, at all. As I began looking into what's been written and collected about Eaton in a few different historic and denominational sources that I consulted, it seemed that most people believed All Souls Church had become a multicultural church simply because David Eaton was Black. As recently as 1993, a UUA publication on multicultural growth described my home church as the outlier in all their efforts to build a set of racially and ethnically diverse congregations. The UUA said, "It is not just a coincidence that the congregation with the largest number of African Americans is the one that had been served for 20 years by the late African American senior minister, having more than 3 times the number of African American members than any other congregation." I wasn't buying this explanation. For one thing, it ignores the fact that there are dozens and dozens of ministers of color serving our churches today, and no other congregation has seen the kind of overwhelming demographic shift that All Souls Church saw throughout the 1970s. Neither, for that matter, have any of our white ministers seen this kind of demographic shift take place in the congregations they serve, regardless of how committed to diversity, multicultural community, or anti-racism they may be. I was, and am still, disappointed that there aren't more places like All Souls in our denomination. Places that reflect the diversity, the growing diversity, we should note, of our country. I was, and am still, disappointed that most UUs have never heard David Eaton's name. More than anything else, I was and still am disappointed that those who have paid attention to Eaton have reduced his work to the circumstances of his race, rather than to digging a little deeper, trying to learn more about the intentions he set and the strategies he used to build a diverse congregation. In our reading this morning, The Road to Reconciliation, Eaton says we should start here with our fears and our depression, our frustrations. So my frustrations led me to research, to find a different way to tell my home congregation's story. I dug through the archives in the basement of All Souls Church for a whole semester during my last year of my Master of Divinity degree. And I found a lot of interesting stories and a lot of unexpected connections. If I can geek out on history for just a moment. I learned how Eaton's history in DC was wrapped up in the early activist days of former DC Mayor Marion Barry and Black Power radical Stokely Carmichael. He knew both of those men and was friends with them. I found a photo of the communist leader and prison reform activist Angela Davis speaking from the All Souls Church pulpit. I also got to interview Issei Barnwell, one of the founding members of Sweet Honey in the Rock, the vocal group. I see a couple nods of recognition out there. She became a member of All Souls Church while Eaton was the minister there. And she founded the Jubilee Singers Choir there that's still singing today. If there are any true Sweet Honey fans out there, their song on children, "Your children are not your children, they are the sons and the daughters of life." Yeah, okay. It was actually written by Issei Barnwell to be sung for child dedications at All Souls Church, at a Unitarian church. So along the way, I picked up on 2 things that I want to share with you this morning. Because if we do believe that it's worth our time and our effort to build multicultural congregations, congregations that minister to all people, then there are definitely a few things that we can learn from David Eaton's ministry. The first lesson I learned is this. To build a multicultural church, David Eaton led a vocal, vision-driven public ministry to clearly communicate a multicultural perspective of racial justice as a religious issue. There's a lot there. I'll say that again. Eaton led a vocal, vision-driven public ministry to communicate a multicultural perspective of racial justice as a religious issue. Eaton used the power of his pulpit to talk about racial issues, first of all. And he didn't just speak about racial issues from one point of view. Eaton talked about how the oppressed, the disinherited, the discriminated against, he talked about how those people experience the subject of race. And he talked about the active allies in the struggle against racial oppression, how those people experience the subject of race. And he talked about the oppressors, both the fully aware, malicious kind, and the uninformed, more passive variety, and how at different times and in different places we can slip between the two. He talked about how those people experience the subject of race. Eaton wasn't shy about offering his Black perspective on racial issues from the pulpit. As he told the search committee at All Souls, "I am first a Black man and second an individual." And his Black perspective was an important perspective. It represented a particular kind of perspective that had been missing from that pulpit since the day that church was built. But Eaton also knew that he could never offer the Black perspective. He recognized that communicating a multicultural perspective on race means being conversant in the full range of opinions present within any given community. Recognizing that there are disagreements and debates on every issue within and beyond racial or ethnic groups. And so Eaton was not just successful at articulating Black perspectives on racial justice because he was Black. Rather, he brought to All Souls pulpit a fascinating personal and professional history. He had made choices throughout his life that found him immersed in the complex conversation within the Black community about immigration and civil rights, militancy, self-determination, and Black power in the 1960s and 70s. He had also made choices that led to his immersion in a variety of multicultural communities, or monocultural communities, actually, that were not his own culture. He began working with UU churches in the 1940s in Boston. He was long engaged in DC's complex and diverse political scene, the local political scene, serving as school board president for the city in the early 1980s. In seeking to understand and communicate these diverse perspectives, Eaton didn't seek to minimize the differences between them. He was working to understand the differences in all their minute detail so that he could give voice to certain people and perspectives that were not often heard in the more monocultural setting of his historic and prestigious congregation. Eaton spoke frequently and extensively, for example, to the direct experiences and encounters of Black people with racism from the pulpit, offering condemnation of the injustice, yes, but also pastoral support to his congregants who faced racism on a day-to-day basis, who were seeking spiritual resources to deal with the enduring struggles of the Black community. In one sermon, he told the story of a multiracial meeting that he'd attended, where Black speakers were, quote, discounted with such haughty condescension. And he asked the congregation, how many Blacks in this congregation today have had at least 20 instances in their lives of the situation I just described? And in the same sermon, which is from the early 1970s, Eaton shares the story of a white man who volunteered with him at a local community organization. And this man confessed to David Eaton that when he first got involved in racial justice work, he said, I felt guilty about a lot of things, and anything that a Black man said, I agreed with. But I've changed, the man said. I've learned to communicate with people from a different culture, and I've moved from paternalism to equity. Eaton was not shy at talking about race. And he certainly had his own point of view. But he made sure that he was always thinking about any person that could walk through the doors of his church on a given Sunday morning, and what their experiences with race and culture might be, how they might be different from his own. The second lesson I learned from David Eaton is this. To build a multicultural church, you have to know the cultures in your context. And you have to consider your blind spots when you look out at that context. Do you have neighbors that that you've perhaps been taught not to see as neighbors, whether out of habit or ill will or the weight of an ugly history, or perhaps out of pure ignorance? Are the lines of your community really drawn where you want them to be drawn? Are they drawn ethically? According to your values? According to the values we all claim to affirm and promote? These are the questions that David Eaton would ask, and he relentlessly pushed his congregation to understand the entire community, really the entire city surrounding their church, as a community they were accountable to. For Eaton, there was no separation between ministry in the church and ministry in the community. This meant that the congregation was really only a training ground or a rehearsal space for how All Souls members should meet and know and care for all their neighbors, all of the people who pass by their way. Liberal and ideological as he could sometimes be, under Eaton's leadership, the church maintained a broad openness to different perspectives within the community. Reverend Eaton, one of his favorite stories, he loved to tell the story of the evening when All Souls Church hosted a Black Panthers meeting in one room and the Metropolitan Police Department in the room across the hall. He said, before the evening was over, they were communicating. I'm not going to tell you what they were communicating, but they were communicating. The idea of extending our ministry out into the community can seem messy and complicated, but it is often the only way to build relationships with the people outside our walls. Our churches, especially our monocultural churches, often have long histories of communicating in less than welcoming ways to a lot of different people. Histories we may not even be aware of, but still impact how our churches are seen in the community. No matter how welcoming we say we are, there's an element of trust and relationship that may simply need to be rebuilt over time. The rebuilding takes risk and humility and real effort. At the very beginning of his ministry at All Souls Church, David Eaton essentially dared his congregation to change the surrounding neighborhood's perception of All Souls Church. You may not know it, he said, but this church is about the job of creating attitudes, not only among the people who come to our services, but also among the people who only think they know us. Not every place is like All Souls. Not every place is as big. Not every place finds itself located in the heart of a city. And sadly, we don't need to look much further than the headlines to see that creating healthy, trusting, mutually affirming, multiracial, multicultural communities is still a countercultural practice in some sense. It still requires effort and risk to unlearn some of what we've been taught about the acceptable expectations for our churches, and to focus instead on how we can better live out our values and our principles. Since the fall of 2001, Rob Hardees has served as senior minister of All Souls Church in DC. Rob is a young, gay, white man who serves on a multiracial staff team and has done tremendous work to sustain the multicultural character of All Souls over time. I saw Rob speak at a conference last year, and he was asked by one of the people in the audience why any of this really is so important. Why should we prioritize this when there are so many other things our churches can do, can be working on? He replied first with a quote from the 19th century Unitarian minister, William Ellery Channing, the quote that gave All Souls Church its name. I am a living member of the great family of all souls. We believe, Rob said, that we are not fully human. We are not living into the fullness of the human family if we don't do this work. It is the job of the church to build and bear witness to the great family of all souls. Let's continue this great work together. And let's make sure that we stop to learn now and then from the great men and women who've been here before. Amen.